Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, everyone, a lectionary podcast from the clergy and today one Digital Missioner of St. Mark's. I'm Rob Schwartz.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm John Kennedy.
And listen, if last week you were watching, if you're not Episcopalian and you were wondering, this lectionary isn't exactly matching up with what we're doing this week, that's because every once in a while, the lectionaries don't exactly play nice with each other. And so if you were reading about 12-year-old Jesus in the temple last week, you're getting it this week. But we gave you an early jump on the beginning of John's gospel. So let's figure out what the misadventures of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy are all about. This reading is Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. The parents of Jesus went to Jerusalem every year for the festival of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. So, this is kind of like, as I said to you guys when we were texting the other day, it reminds me of the biblical Home Alone story, except Jesus isn't exactly alone when they find him. So does anyone want to kind of lay out the context of where we're at, what's going on?
Well, yeah, Luke's given us this beautiful birth narrative, and then right before this story, we get Jesus' 8-day circumcision and presentation in the temple to Anna, and so he's, the framework of this story is so far is that Jesus has been brought up squarely in this Jewish tradition. He's very much in an observant family. And, the parents do exactly what they're expected to do with their new child. And he receives this blessing from Simeon and Anna in the temple. And then, he becomes 12. So the implication is he's getting his bar mitzvah and going up to participate in Passover for the first time as a adult male, or at least passing into that period of his life. So I feel like, Luke is giving us the idea that Jesus is very much a solid Jew.
Yeah.
Definitely is a solid Jew, following all that. I just add on to, just in addition to, so we're finishing the whole prehistory, chapters 1 and 2,
right.
And it's a tremendous amount of movement here just to bring us all the way back. We go from Nazareth to Bethlehem to Jerusalem to Nazareth, and now here we are back in Jerusalem. As the pod goes, there's disagreement over whether or not this is the bar mitzvah, but anyway, which is going to be part of the fun of us, whether or not 12 is the year before the bar mitzvah and whether or not he's an adult, but that's a whole other thing, whether or not.
Well, the age 12 has significance, right? I don't think that Luke would pick age 12 if it wasn't some kind of rite of passage.
Like on the cusp of being a man.
Yeah, and he feels, and up to now, everything about Jesus' mission and identity has been told by others. We got the angels, Mary, Elizabeth, the shepherds, Simeon, Anna, and here he's kind of owning it for himself.
Well, and the fact that he's still a child basically at this point, and that he's garnered kind of the admiration and the attention of, these teachers in the temple is very significant. I think, and John, I want to hear from you, but I just want to say, one of the interesting things is I think it's very easy to get caught up on the setup of this story. Like, you go, oh my God, they lost their kid for 3 days. It took them a full day to realize that. Obviously, it's probably a big caravan of people they're traveling with. They're assuming he's probably with other family members or friends or others who are kind of looking out for him. Mm-hmm. And it's probably, my guess, at the end of the day, things are settling down and they're like, okay, wait, where's Jesus again? So we get so lost in that, and yet really the big focus of this is on Jesus. It's a very Christological passage and trying to say something very important about who Jesus is. Something we're really, all the attention of every character in this is really directed at him. So, John, if you got anything?
Yeah, of course, that is right on. That this episode concludes the introductory material of Luke's gospel before John the Baptist as an adult, which we looked at during Advent, and then, of course, the beginning of Jesus' ministry when we are told in Luke that he was 30. And it sits in an interesting way alongside the other episodes. We've talked about how there are all these stories that proceed, and there are 7 total, including this. So we get 2 annunciations, John and Jesus, the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, 2 birth narratives, the presentation of Jesus in the temple, as we talked about. And now Jesus is back in the temple. And those previous 6 sort of have interesting symmetries and parallelisms and so on. They're sort of like a diptych, to use a visual metaphor, but this one is not fitting in that way. And yet it continues this question that obviously Luke is, just as with all the gospel authors, very focused on, which is, who is Jesus? And Luke answers this question obviously principally by saying that Jesus is, the Son of God and the Messiah, but part of that means being an observant Jew, grounded in the tradition, in continuity with the tradition, but also being and doing something very, very new and unexpected and without precedent. And just to say that the way that this follows what comes before and the way that it sets up what comes next. I mean, Luke is the only gospel author to tell us anything about Jesus as a child, really drives the point of Jesus's divinity or divine sonship home. So during the Annunciation, Gabriel says to Mary, your child will be the Son of God. And here he talks about God as his Father, which is shocking. This is the first time we hear from Jesus, and he's talking about God as his Father. Now, that might just sort of go like this. It might pass us by without recognizing any significance. But in this time, it was not common for Jews to talk about God as their Father and such... Jesus basically only referred to God as Father, and fatherly imagery was there in the scriptures and the tradition, but it wasn't common and probably wasn't even really all that acceptable for Jews to just say, "Oh yeah, my Father." God,
and they don't understand.
Right?
It says explicitly they don't understand.
That's the don't understand line.
In Judaism, God and in Christianity, God is holy, God is transcendent, while also being present and active in the world. But this sort of very, very close intimacy was very, very interesting. And then later, of course, in the baptism, we hear the voice from heaven speaking about Jesus, "You are my beloved Son." So it's all obviously driving this point home.
But you're right, it's huge because, everything we had before is really Luke trying to get across the point that Jesus is God's Son. But this is really Jesus making that claim for himself.
Yeah.
And these are his first words in Luke's gospel. Like when he speaks, I think it's very key that this is kind of the beginning of all that.
I just want to insert here.
Yeah.
We're yes to everything that's been said in Luke. I've become really, really convinced and looking at this with this is actually Mary's gospel. This is Mary's story. You cannot do the whole first 2 chapters. It's all Mary. How do you know about the visitation? How do you know about the annunciations? How do you know what they said? This whole thing is Mary's story. Somehow the tradition has handed it down, whether or not Luke met with Mary, spoke with Mary. This should be called the Gospel according to Mary.
Oh, I like that.
Good one, yeah. And back to, the parallelisms or diptych stories leading up to this. This one really has an echo to Samuel, and in Lucan fashion, he often through this gospel draws on Old Testament stories and picks up whole phrases and whole lines. And in Samuel, when Samuel's born and given to the temple by Hannah, it says about him, he continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and man. And Fred Craddock, who writes the interpretation book on Luke, he's clear. I love him. And he talks about how Luke loves to draw. He's so steeped in the Old Testament stories, and that they're so familiar to him and to his audience that he uses them as patterns and framework for telling the stories, but not to claim authority, but to just package this brand new thing in something familiar in order to make people disarm them to accept it, in something that they can get their heads around. And I thought that was really incredible insight. So it does continue with the parallelisms, but he draws back further. So I thought that was really interesting.
Before we move on too much, just hanging on to the very beginning, kind of the setup and the 3 days that it took them to find him. And I feel like it's just my own ignorance that I wasn't really thinking about this until I started kind of, brushing up on this one again. And, in a sense, this is really foreshadowing Jesus' death and resurrection. He disappears, takes 3 days, and they find him in an unlikely place, in an unlikely situation. And it's really kind of the beginning of something new. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so
yeah, for sure.
I feel like there's a lot of things that are intentional that, it's easy to just gloss over. I feel like that's probably something.
And a lot, oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Of course, not only the location, Jerusalem and the temple, but also the time of year, the festival, the Passover. This is where and when Jesus will die, roughly 33 years later. So it's sort of chilling in that way to know what lies down the road, and the way that clearly Luke has this in mind. And it's such I think a challenge to our observance of Christmas to celebrate and really connect with the joy and wonder of Jesus as a baby and here of Jesus as a child, while also, the shadow of Calvary, of the cross, is always present in our story. I mean, that's made especially clear in our Christmas Eve liturgies. We have the Christmas pageant, right? Followed by a celebration of the Holy Eucharist, which cannot help but call to mind these events, his passion. So very interesting. And while we're on that topic, I just want to note something that, speaking of parallels, this story seems to parallel the Emmaus story, the resurrection story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus and how Jesus appears to them. Because here, Jesus, as a child, in today's story, is missing for 3 days. Well, what is the period between his death and resurrection? Of course. And his parents don't know where he is in this story, and in a different sort of way, his disciples and everybody who loved him and cared about him, they don't really know where he is. They think he's gone. They don't know. And there are reports going around by the time the Emmaus story happens that he's been seen, but nobody, aside from maybe those who have seen, nobody really knows what to make of that. And yet Jesus appears, or they find Jesus, but what he does and what he says is unexpected. I think it's a fascinating sort of bookending of the life of Jesus as Luke tells it.
Yeah, I think that yes, and yes, and all that. I think that one of the things that's particularly interesting about this passage is how little it comes forward to us. And it's the only time we have Jesus as a kid. We have him as a 12-year-old. As you all know, we have Jesus from his birth. We have Jesus from 8 days. We have Jesus at 2 years. We have Jesus at 12, and then we have Jesus at 29 or 30. And so we're talking about a theography, not a biography. This is a theological telling of Jesus' story, dressed in all the Hebrew clothing you were just referring to, Elizabeth, and then filled with all of the illusions and patterns that we're elucidating here. But I think that one of the things that's particularly interesting for us is the theological speculation about Jesus as a boy. And there's a few places we can go with this. One is we can just say these are the lost years, the hidden years, and just say nothing about them. But, what is the thing about love's a void or love's a gap and all the things that have poured into that? And just also to claim that the gospel, according to Thomas, has all kinds of stuff. As Jesus,
5-year-old Jesus.
And I'm just going to name that Jesus makes clay birds and brings them to life. He causes a child's body to wither. He strikes some of his neighbors with blindness, and he resurrects a friend who's died, and he heals his brother from a snake bite. And just to say that the church said no.
Yeah.
to that. I mean, so we're getting here something that our tradition says, yes, 12. But this making us friends with her, no, that's not part of the mix.
And I love how in the Gospel of Thomas, that one thing with the friend where the friend falls out a window and they all think it's Jesus who pushed him out and killed him, and he's like, I didn't do it. And he's like, he calls his friend's name and says, Rise, and he's like, did I kill you? And the friend's like, no, it wasn't you. It's at least entertainment.
I thought that was a Gospel of Peter.
Oh, was it?
Something.
I thought that was Thomas.
Thomas is just sayings. It's a collection of sayings.
It's confusing because there's what is known as the infancy Gospel of Thomas, but it's a different.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking. You're right.
But then there is the Gospel of Peter, I think, that has this interesting material about Jesus having incredible powers as a boy too.
Yes.
Yeah. But both of which were obviously excluded from the canon. And very interesting, right, that those texts are focused on Jesus having powers. And obviously, it's natural to have the question, okay, so if Jesus had powers as an adult, and if he's the Son of God, when did this start? And for Luke, I mean, obviously the other gospel writers don't really seem to think it's at least it's not a worthwhile enough question to waste, ink on their limited papyri. And Luke touches on it, but he has no interest in Jesus having powers. Jesus, he's gifted and he's got this very deep spirituality, but he's also kind of normal,
And also for Luke, it's not even important enough to carry forward the virgin birth story. He just got done telling us that, he's conceived by the Holy Spirit, and already, his parents are sort of puzzling over why he would say, in my Father's house. There's no connection to that story in this story. And I find that super interesting.
Yeah.
Whether it was just Mary's kind of secret or who knows, but I thought that was super.
And I think so much of this is him as a teacher and people responding to that. And just several weeks down the road from this passage, we go ahead to where Jesus is preaching in his hometown, and he reads what the scriptures and says, today this has been fulfilled. So there's a lot of mirroring there as well. And the
layering of this, and I mean, some of this is not only what's in there, but circling back to one other thing here, is what's not in there. And I just want to call out to make sure people who might not be exposed to this might have some understanding that Jesus plays a big role in the Quran. He's the most mentioned name in the Quran, for instance, and but they have different miracles in the Quran than we do. And just to say that the baby Jesus speaks. One of the miracles is the Jesus in the manger defends his mother Mary, and who's being accused. And it says, so baby Jesus responded. He said, I am God's servant. He has given me the book and made me a prophet. And then later down, it says, and this is the baby in the manger, no less. Okay, he has made me dutiful toward my mother, and he has not made me arrogant or wicked. And so in the Quran, we get a little bit of that last. What they give in the manger, we get at the last line there that Jesus went back to Nazareth and was a good boy who grew up to be good looking, and he was wisdom, and his friends he grew up in, all this sort of thing. That they put it in a completely different place here.
I think your T-shirt's quoting the Quran.
Baby
Jesus.
You're quoting.
You should just say baby Jesus.
Quoting the Blues Brothers, and there's Jake Blues through and through.
When I was thinking, what do I wear for this? I always try to sync it up, and I thought, well, this is like I said before, this is very much Jesus claiming his mission here.
Missionary gospel.
I'm on a mission from God.
Nice, Rob.
So
nice.
I picture Jesus saying that in a Blues Brothers voice. But so talking about what is it Jesus says? I must be about. I must be in my Father's house. I must be about my Father's business. There's different translations, and in some ways the Greek's ambiguous. And so I was looking at a commentary from O. Wesley Allen, who used to teach at the seminary I went to before I got there. But he points out that the phrase could mean to be in the house of my Father. So it's the temple setting, right? It could be as among the people of my Father. He's among the teachers. And this is who Jesus has been talking to, or about the things of my Father. That's kind of the King James Version, and others, translate it in that way. So, and I don't know if there's anything in particular we're supposed to land on, if it's supposed to be ambiguous. All of them kind of reveal a little something different about what Jesus is about.
One thing I think is he's simply not lost. They think he's lost, and he's absolutely where he knows his home, and he's comfortable there. He's safe. He's in his zone, and I think throughout Luke, lost and found is the whole theme. Like you already touched on this, John, going to Emmaus, but we also have Luke 15. The lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost pearl, the lost son. Who was lost and is found. And as you've already said, he was sort of lost to his disciples at his crucifixion. And then he goes in search of his lost disciples on the road to Emmaus and finds them. And he says, meet me back in Jerusalem. They're all going to come home to the center and go out to the ends of the earth from there. So I think that Luke has a really purposeful theme here with the losing and finding.
Yeah, that's a good call on your part. I like that. This question of how we translate the kind of rounded nature where these words mean much more than just the way we translate them. And one of those other words could be, I'm in my father's house, or I'm about my father's affairs. Mm-hmm. And Joseph, this is the last time we see Joseph, and Joseph is still there. And I'm wondering if this is going Joseph. Well, actually, this is not where we live. And our affairs are, how do you say that?
What am I, chopped liver?
Tecton, or, carpenter or bricklayer or something like that. We're working in Sephora's, building a community here. This is,
yes.
And it says, as you pointed out earlier, they don't understand, like, huh?
Right.
This is,
Yeah. And then he goes down back to Nazareth with them and is obedient. It's like, his self-emptying Luke style, He's like, well, I could stay here and show them who I really am, or I'll just go home and be a good boy.
I think that detail is important because when Jesus appears in Nazareth as an adult teaching in the synagogue, they don't really know who he is, or they do, but they don't really know him as a prophet or obviously as a Messiah. They're astonished. So he didn't garner a reputation for being outstanding in this way. So it seems that Luke is trying to suggest that Jesus sort of lived fairly quietly, at least as far as his local town was concerned. Because of course, this story doesn't take place in Nazareth, so the idea is they probably never heard about it.
Jesus said, "We'll just put a pin in this one for now."
So yeah, something like that.
Yeah, right.
That he'll fulfill.
You'll look back on this
he's fulfilling the law, right? I mean, this is a theme that's particularly prevalent in Matthew, but it's certainly in Luke. Obviously, we've talked about it with Jesus being presented in the temple and his parents raising him according to the traditions and the customs and to the law, and that Jesus is following the law. Like the fifth commandment is, honor your father and mother. I think we're meant to understand that he did that.
And the kind of closing bit of this passage where it says, Jesus increased in wisdom and divine and human favor, but even before that, his mother treasured all these things in her heart.
Yeah.
I think that's, there was a thing Rob Bell was talking about this one time, and he says he views it as less of an awe and more of a whoa. So for Mary, it's not like, oh, remember Jesus did all that stuff in the temple, everything that happened. It's more like, whoa, okay, there's something special here. There's something going on, and I'm gonna.
Oh, it's interesting because I'm in a different place, which is I can also be translated. Mary tried to put the pieces together. I think she's trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
Yeah.
She has partial information. The Annunciation doesn't lay everything out here. Excuse me, and then we get the prophetess Anna, and we get Simeon. She's getting all this data. She's getting all this information, and she's trying to figure out how to make sense out of it. And now we have the first time where Jesus is claiming these truths for himself, which is something you were pointing out, John. And so there's more. And this is as when the shepherds arrive and they say what happened, the Annunciation of the shepherds, and they repeat it and said, we get again. She pondered these things, treasured these things, tried to figure these things out.
Right.
Well, back to the two on the road to Emmaus, that's how he leaves them in his wake. They're like, oh, putting the pieces together. They met him in the breaking of the bread, and he was gone from their sight. And it doesn't say they treasured all these things in their heart, but it says something about how their hearts burned within them.
Yeah.
And I think this is another bracket where Luke is such a genius, presaging all of that.
Good. I love that burn within them. Yeah, that's good.
So as we're slowly,
I don't want to finish up. I
want to stay here too.
Can I just say one more thing here?
Jesus' hidden years.
Okay, so now can I just say a thing about that?
Let's get a little.
Just because I'm I'm just a priest, right? In other words, I don't actually know besides
You're
what I've
so much
studied.
more than that, Peter.
Yeah. I'm a human being too. Okay.
What were your lost years?
Yeah, my lost. Oh, wow. Yeah, a lot to say about my lost years. And the wrap-up signs, and Rob's trying to take control.
I'm not even on the other end of the camera holding up signs.
We welcome Beth, by the way, Beth Ralston here, who's giving us the old wrap-up sign now. You've trained her well, Rob. I just want to put in a quick speculative theological word here. So a lot of what we're talking about is that comes out of the text. And then we also talk about things that we bring into the text. And then we also talk about things that aren't in the text at all. And then there's a vacuum and what the traditions have done. I was trained with the same seminary that you two were, and I would, all of the speculative stuff was cast aside by the great teachers that we sat in front of. And then later in life I started to just read around, and I thought it was more and more interesting when I read around, and not to put a lot of emphasis one way or the other. I mean, do I really believe Jesus was a carpenter? I actually don't believe Jesus was a carpenter. I think that Jesus was a trained rabbi in some way. And I was talking earlier, shout out to Russ Barksdale, who a friend of ours who wrote a big piece on studying Talmudic literature about what does the Talmud say about Jesus? Who did he train for? They have the name of the rabbi they say he trained with, and all sorts of extra biblical stuff that we as Christians don't look at, but it's in our Judaic, it's in our siblings' literature. And so I actually think of Jesus more as a rabbi. He's identified as a rabbi as he moves forward. Of course, rabbi doesn't mean you're officially ordained with this, with all of the accoutrement of that. And then the second thing that, of course, I became particularly interested in was I used to cast aside that Jesus lived in India, and it doesn't matter to me if Jesus lived in India, but I do think the speculation around it is kind of fun. I discovered in Kashmir there's a place where they venerate, where Isa, as he's known in India, Saint Isa as he's known there, and he's known as Isa in the Quran. There's just something to say. There's way more traditions are out there than we, with our narrow, blinded Western eyes, can see, because we don't live in these places. We don't experience these other things. And the whole movement, when Buddhism was finally discovered by the West. I mean, Buddhism predates Christianity, but it wasn't discovered until much later in the West. And people started to say, oh, well, the Buddha and Jesus have a lot in common. And did he study here and learn these things? A lot of speculation, all of which I find is fun. And I have no need for any of it to be doctrinal. I think the speculation of it is really interesting and fun. But I just want to put in, a note that there's that whole other thing there, including that Jesus lived in Britain.
Before we even get to all that other stuff, I mean, there's so much in the text that we don't appreciate. I mean, he was called a teacher, rabbi, like 90 out of 120 times that he's addressed in Scripture. And if that's not enough to say he was a rabbi, I don't know what is. And, people want to kind of downplay Jesus the teacher. But what's better? What's more lasting than wise teaching? And of course, he died and was raised and gave us the Holy Spirit. I mean, we wouldn't be here without that. But without the teaching, there's like no life to live. There's no road to walk. It's gets down to the daily what Jesus was teaching us to do. And there's so much in Scripture that our own tradition ignores and sets aside and refuses to live by, risk our lives for, sacrifice for. I mean, the creed is enough to tell us we've missed the boat. It leaves out all of that. So it does. It leaves out all the teaching and healing.
But there's a good reason for that.
Well, in its time and place. Yeah. But now, I don't know. I think it's time for upgrading our content. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You can take my collar.
This is good.
We're saving this for the hot takes
Jesus' life is not even in the creed.
You can have the creed plus. You don't need to only have the creed.
You got to respond to this.
In defense of the creed, they came about to resolve disputes, theological disputes.
Yeah, that's what I said. In its time and place, it was appropriate.
But the audience doesn't. A lot of our audience knows that, but some may not.
Exactly my point.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. I was on board with the idea of Jesus being formally trained. Back to Rob Bell, he had Rob Bell was a very, influential and creative Christian teacher in his time. I mean, he's still around, but he's doing different things. And he had a really interesting sort of teaching video based on a sermon all about Jesus likely going through all the rabbinic training, and then what it meant for his disciples who were not going through that sort of training and not set up for that kind of life to be called as disciples of a rabbi. So I was really into that, and I still find that interesting. But then later I was reminded that in Mark 6, it said that Jesus is a carpenter. I was like, oh. So, I mean, Jesus is certainly recognized as a teacher, but whether that's simply
maybe he worked at McDonald's
a
for 5
recognition of
minutes.
his incredible learning and stature and wisdom and charisma, or whether it's because of his credentials. I mean, we have, in Christianity and many Protestant traditions, certain clergy are called bishop, even though they're not really bishops in the way we think of it. So I don't know. I don't know. But I find it very interesting. And I like you're saying, Peter, I don't think it's important to settle on a take. I think it's very fruitful just to think about the possibilities. And because I think even if Jesus never went to India, thinking about why some people think he did illuminates important and really exciting connections and points of convergence between what Jesus was about and what Jesus said, and the traditions and the spirituality of India, let's say. So I'm all for all of that.
I mean, one of the things I like about it, the Christmas story, the angels, the annunciation of the angels is that the birth is for all people. And so we have Jesus is a Jewish man. It's a Hebrew story, right? A fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures. But when we have this movement where he breaks into another culture, it gives us a taste, at least for me, that this is part of the for all peopleness.
Yeah. Well, Matthew gets Persians in the mix.
Persians, right? Yep. Amen. No, good call. And he goes to Egypt, and yeah.
So if this podcast has taught me nothing else, not only do I not have the ability to land the plane from behind the camera, I don't even have the ability to get these guys to land the plane from in front of the camera. So anyway.
Okay, we just have to tell everybody a few things.
But you
here.
do have editing power.
You have no power, Rob. But you have all love. We love you. And so I want everybody to know a few things. One is, the reason you're sitting here is you're the preacher man.
It is.
And
I'm looking forward to that.
Then this is the day... the first Sunday in January. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Okay, we're a little bit ahead on our pods here. And to say that you are a tremendous preacher, and you have a great gift, not only behind the camera, but in front of the camera. And that we're really honored not only to have you sit back where Beth is, but to sit here with us.
Well, and what I loved is, for on the Episcopal lectionary anyway, there were 3 options for the gospel that we could have, read and preached from on this particular Sunday. And this is the one that, felt like a no-brainer, because I was like, we really don't get into child Jesus that often.
Right.
And Jesus disappearing from his parents, really, I connected with that because I did that to my parents all the time as a kid.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Little tease. But what I loved is it led me to that place, and then actually bringing me down that road in this passage really brought me even deeper into who Jesus was. And it became less about me saying, like, how can I be more like Jesus? And I found myself in the role of his parents and the teachers sitting with what he had to say. And so hopefully all of you, like us and like everyone, we continue to kind of sit with these words, ponder them, treasure them in our hearts, and see what grows. And usually where we expect to find Jesus and how we expect to find Jesus in our lives is not at all what we thought it would be. So with that, it's been great being with you guys and with all of you, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.